My name is not Matthew, and welcome to my D&D channel. Here on Under the Dice, I take a look at the math of 5e and I use my background in political economy to help you build coherent fantasy economies for your D&D worlds. Today I want to talk about the Great Sword and the Great Axe. Or more specifically, what I want to talk about is weapons that are D12 versus weapons that are 2d6. The reason we're taking the Great Sword and the Great Axe is not only are they the iconic weapons for this debate, but they're both deal slashing damage, meaning we don't have to take into account which damage type is best. We can do analysis by the means. If we're going to talk about averages, on average the 2d6 is better than the d12 by 0.5. If we look at the median, it's again the same thing. If we go by the mod of 2d6 is 7. Well, when it comes to the d12, there is no mod. Now, the importance of this is that when you roll 2d6, you can expect a specific result to be more frequent than the rest, while you cannot do so for the d12. In terms of being predictable, 2d6 is a lot more predictable than 1d12. Beyond that, the fact is that the 2d6 minimum damage is 2. While they both have the same max, the d12 only has a minimum of 1. If we stop our analysis at these very specific parameters, it's hard to understand why someone would ever want to use a d12 weapon instead of a 2d6 weapon. But that's not where the analysis should end. But we shouldn't be too much in a hurry to move away from analysis of the means. Because if you're going to use a Great Axe or a Great Sword, chances are that you are going to be a martial class, which is going to have access to taking great weapon fighting. Great weapon fighting allows you to reroll a 1 or a 2 on your weapon die, but you must keep the result of the new die. That means, mathematically speaking, that you're actually widening the gap in a means analysis between the Great Sword and the Great Axe. Instead of finding yourself with a gap of 0.5 in the averages, you find yourself with a gap of 1. Great weapon fighting increases the lead that the Great Sword has over the Great Axe. Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition is a system that doesn't care how much pain your character is in. If he has 1 HP, he's just as powerful in terms of the action economy as if he had full health. Other systems have sometimes a mechanic called pain penalty. In those systems, dealing damage quickly leads you to snowball into victory. But in 5e, your damage per attack might not be the best way to analyze which weapon is better. We might want to instead take into consideration which window a weapon is better in. In other words, depending on how much damage you need to take away an action economy, which weapon is then better? That might be somewhere the Great Axe is going to be able to reduce the lead of the Great Sword. We are going to need a concept of given result required. We're not really going to care about the amount of damage we're dishing out. We need to take into account what was the result needed on the die to take out the target. If you only needed to roll a 1, well, the Great Sword is not really better than the Axe, since both weapons are guaranteed to roll a 1. So that is going to allow us to compare the distribution of both weapons. So first, let's take our distributions, make them cumulative. And now we can do the difference between both weapons. This shows you when the Great Sword is better than the Great Axe, and when the Great Axe is better than the Great Sword, and what's the percentage of chance of getting that or higher compared to the other one. If these percentages are a little bit too confusing for you, it's okay, let's simplify it down to a color code. Red means that the Great Axe is worse than the Great Sword. Yellow means that for that given result required, they're the same. Green means that for that given result required, the Great Axe is more likely to hit a target than the Great Sword, And if it's blue, well, this is a window that only the Great Axe could hit and not the Great Sword. So far, within the windows of possibility for both of our distribution, the Great Sword is the better weapon half of the time. And it's only an inferior weapon a third of the time. And if the given result required to take an action economy away from the target is higher than 12, well then the higher expected damage of the Great Sword is just better than that of the Great Axe. Yeah, this doesn't really help the Great Axe right now. I mean, the Great Axe at least has a small niche, but that window is pretty small. If we take into account great weapon fighting, that window where the Great Axe is better than the Great Sword doesn't really shrink, but in places where it's just as good does. Things aren't looking good for the Great Axe so far, and yet they might just get worse. When the given result required is small, the Great Sword is more reliable, and when it's higher outside of the range of the Great Axe, well, the average damage of the Great Swords brings you quicker to downing the target. Its window is very small. But what about crits? Could crits save the Great Axe? If we do the same protocol again, but this time with the crit damage, we can see the situation isn't much better. With regular damage, the Great Axe was just as good or better than the Great Sword in half of the cases within their achievable window. Now it's not even the case. I mean, okay, it's still better than the Great Sword with the same third of the cases of the window. But it loses ground again. We've seen how the Great Sword only gets better than the Great Axe when we start to consider crit damage. And that's only going to be made truer if the crit range is increased. Now, the exact amount of damage increased by taking into account the crit range can't exactly be determined. Because while it's true that your amount of crits per attack is predictable, the amount of crit per hit depends on the AC of the target. So since your damage depends on your per hit, not your per attack, it's hard to tell by how much the sword gets better when we take into account crits. But it does. But the crit range isn't the only way by which crits can be improved. Can the Great Axe win with abilities that add die to your crits? Let's do the same protocol all over again, but this time for a Nork that can add an extra die of its weapon when it crits. So we're going to compare 3d12s and 5d6. Now, here's the distribution. As you can see, the Great Axe is way better than the Great Sword here. I mean, one of the important things is for a big part of the window that the Great Axe can hit, the sword can't even touch it. And beyond that, now, when we take into account on crits, the Great Axe is better on average than the Great Sword. I mean, here, on these crits, these boosted crits, the Great Axe completely blows out the Great Sword out of the water. So we have one parameter where the Great Axe is better than the Great Sword. But we also have great weapon fighting that made the Great Sword better than the Great Axe. If we combine the two, does it change anything? Here's the distribution. As you can see, not really. Even if you have great weapon fighting, the Great Axe still completely destroys the Great Sword on crits. But that's the thing. Even with this here, this is only on crits. That means that, reliably speaking, the Great Sword is still gonna edge out the Great Axe. So unless you have some way of increasing your ratio of crits versus regular hit, the Great Axe is going to be the inferior weapon. The Great Axe seems to only truly be the best weapon in the hands of a champion orc. Okay, you don't need to go all the way to champion orc. You can be an... no, you have to be a champion orc. Do you have an opinion on this debate between the Great Sword and the Great Axe? If so, you are welcome to leave a comment. I read all of them and respond to most. If you've watched until the end, I'm new at this. I know I make a lot of mistakes as a YouTuber. All constructive criticism are not only considered, but desired.